Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to this webinar on federal direct pay programs that can help houses of worship pay for solar and other emission reducing infrastructure. My name is Reverend Jenny Phillips. I'm the Director of Environmental Sustainability for Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church. I'm happy to share that this webinar is being recorded. It will be shared on Interfaith Power and Light's YouTube page. And after the webinar, we will share the link to the recording as well as links to all the materials referenced today. So don't worry about having to write down every link that gets put in the chat or gets referenced. We will gather those up and share them with you after the webinar. I'm here today with Miguel Yanez Barnuevo with Environmental and Energy Study Institute, Eric Walker of Vashon United Methodist Church in Washington State, and Tiffany Hartung of Interfaith Power and Light. And I also want to thank Reverend Jonathan Brake of Global Ministries for handling the behind the scenes of our webinar today. Thanks, Jonathan. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I want to share for just a moment about Global Ministries. We are the Mission and Humanitarian Assistance Agency of the United Methodist Church. We seek to ensure justice, freedom, peace, health, and well-being for all. And we seek for people of all faiths to live in dignity and security. And we're so grateful for the presence of a variety of faith perspectives at this webinar today, from Muslims, Jewish people, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Unitarian Universalists. All are welcome here, and we are so very glad to be in this community with you, where we are honoring the creation of the one we believe is divine, and working together to figure out how to care for it. Global Ministries is committed to just and equitable net zero emissions by 2050 across ministries, facilities, operations, and investments. One of the roles of the agency's environmental sustainability program is to support the churches and the communities in our denomination in emission reduction. You can learn more about this work at the link in the chat. If you have any trouble today hearing or understanding any of us speakers, know that closed captioning is available for this webinar. If you look on your Zoom menu bar, it's probably at the bottom of your screen, there will be a button for captions, or if you can't see it, but there is a more button, it might be under more. That's how, if you can't understand what you're hearing, you can get the text put on the screen so you can be sure to follow. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Tiffany Hartung, the Chief Strategy Officer for Interfaith Power and Light. She's here to share a little bit more about the webinar series of which this webinar is a part, as well as other relevant resources. Tiffany, will you offer a few words, please?
Thanks, Jenny. And I want to give a special thank you to UMC Global Ministries and EESI for hosting this important discussion, and Eric for you joining to share your real life experience and with folks who have lots of questions and will learn from your experience. So I'll say that our groups here, as well as many who are not here, like on screen, but are co-hosting on this webinar, have been coordinating with a number of faith-based partners to offer this webinar series around the federal benefits for houses of worship related to the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And you can see some of those recordings from previous webinars on our YouTube account. Thank you, Jonathan, for dropping those in the chat. The Inflation Reduction Act, as I'll refer to as IRA, going forward, is in particular, as many of you all know, it created the largest climate investment and clean energy investment in the history of the U.S., including many that will be impactful for houses of worship. The faith community, including many of you, worked tirelessly to help pass this important legislation, so thank you for helping to do that. Jonathan is dropping in the chat some additional resources that we have on our website that might also help you with questions about other resources for houses of worship that apply to that, or even on direct pay as well. We also have an FAQ on direct pay that we have worked with DOE to answer many of those questions and get into some of the technical questions. So hoping that might be a helpful resource. We also have some additional resources about our solar congregation work and our cool congregation resources that Jonathan's also dropping in the chat that I just wanted to highlight that also may be helpful for you as you all are on this journey to reduce your faith community's climate emissions. Our Cool Congregation Startup Kit may be particularly useful for those of you on the just beginning this journey. So want to share those resources and in case they're helpful. So the last thing I want to say about before we jump into the details here is that we all know that these IRA climate investments are critical to helping the US meet our climate goals. And we also know that there have been some attempts by those in Congress to prevent these investments from going forward. So because of this, it's important for the faith community to continue to communicate with policymakers about the importance of these investments to achieve our climate goals. And so I want to share we're sharing a link in the chat that IPL and our faith-based partners are working to collect these stories from all of you doing this work of reducing your emissions, utilizing these climate investments in your houses of worship so that we can tell these stories to members of Congress, in the media, and to other houses of worship to inspire them to also take these first steps, which can seem daunting. So please share your story with us. These stories are shared across this form goes to a number of different partners to see and share your stories with us. We want to hear what you're doing. Fill out this form in the chat and help us learn about the exciting work that you're doing. So that's all I have to say. I'll turn it back over to you, Jenny, to get us started.
Thanks so much for your leadership. During this webinar, we're sharing information about direct pay opportunities for nonprofits. We advertised it as houses of worship because that's our audience, but actually these opportunities are for broadly for nonprofits through the Inflation Reduction Act. The information was gathered through research and personal experience, but I just want to note that none of the presenters are IRS professionals and nothing we say should be understood as legal advice. So you know what to expect. We'll start out with a high-level overview of direct pay for solar with Miguel. Then Eric will share a case study from his church on applying for direct pay. And after that, I'll share a few framing thoughts for you to use if you're thinking about where you are in your solar journey and whether or not direct pay is right for your house of worship. After that, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat at any time. We're going to be organizing questions and kind of combining them to avoid repeats. So we'll ask questions after all the presentations are done, and we'll do it all through the chat. One other thing I do want to note is that we've gotten lots of questions already, and I just want to emphasize the focus of this webinar is on the direct pay program, and I hope you'll check out the other resources that Tiffany shared if you're looking for something broader about basic how-tos of solar or energy efficiency or other related topics. Now we want to start out with a poll to help give us a sense of your familiarity with the direct pay program already. So take a moment and answer this question. What do you know about direct pay? It's new to me. I wanted to learn more. I have some information, but I still have questions. Or my house of worship is installing solar and applying for direct pay. This is great. I'm so glad. Oh, you probably can't see it yet. I'm sorry. I'll wait till the poll closes. Are people still registering their responses? So I won't give it away just yet. All right. I think we're about ready to close the poll, Jonathan. All right, I believe you can see the results. You can see 59% of you are here because this is new to you and you're curious and you want to learn more. Fantastic. Welcome. 31% of you have started looking into this. You gathered some information and you still have questions. And then 10% of you are already on the journey. Fantastic. You all could be panelists in the next webinar to share how your journey with direct pay went. Thanks so much for participating, everyone. All right, next I want to introduce Miguel Yanez Barnuevo, who leads EESI's Access Clean Energy Savings Program. His focus is on ensuring federal investments for energy efficiency and clean energy and on equity and justice. Miguel, will you share with us today?
Yes, thank you, Roland, Jenny. I'm very excited to be here with all of you presenting about direct pay and the benefits that it can provide and the opportunities for houses of worship and nonprofits. Um, um, Through this presentation on accessing direct payments for clean energy devices, including solar panels. Next slide, please. So a few words about the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, ESI for short. ESI is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. We do a lot of work on providing education to policymakers on issues like this one and on energy efficiency and renewable energy, and as well as other technologies that help combat the climate crisis. And we've been doing this for 40 years. This is our 40th year anniversary. Next slide, please. And and so I'm here to talk about direct pay, but I think it's always important to start with energy efficiency and make sure that your facility that you want to install the solar panels or the clean energy device is well insulated, has is very well tied in terms of energy, and you have gone through a process of understanding what you need to install, the doing an energy audit, benchmarking your facilities, and then identifying the best measures to make your facilities more efficient, which will ensure that whatever you are placing, the solar panels or the battery storage, is more cost effective. And at the same time, you're getting all the multiple benefits from energy efficiency, as including reducing energy waste and improving the air quality of your facilities, as well as reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. Next page, next slide, please. And so what we're doing here is to put all the pieces together. So you have gone through that journey of identifying the resources, installing energy efficiency, and now you're ready to install solar panels and other clean energy devices like a battery storage. For that, you can think about grants like the Department of Energy, Americans nonprofit. You can think about the cash reserve that you might have. You might think about using utility rebates available to make everything make sense, everything to put together. You can also using finance, and using direct pay for nonprofits as a way to get that direct payment or cash allocation from the federal government that you receive as a certain percentage after placing into service the clean energy device in your facility. Next slide, please. So direct pay, or also called elective pay, is a game changer. There's a lot of information I will go through in these slides and next few slides. That is also available in our fact sheet that will be linked in the chat, and it will also be available in the information that will be sent out after this webinar. The fact sheet has a lot of resources that you might find useful, so please take a look at that. So first, what is direct pay? Direct pay, as mentioned, it was created as part of the Inflation Reduction Act in 2002. It is a tweak in the tax code which allows for the monetization of clean energy tax credits, a total of 12 tax credits And in this webinar, we're going to be looking more at the investment tax credits for solar and battery storage. And so it's an array of tax credits which are reauthorized through 2033. And for the first time, it allows, thanks to this modification in tax code, for tax-exempt entities and nonprofits to directly access these tax credits that previously were not able to access. And so now these entities can access payment from the Internal Revenue Service. So again, this direct pay runs through the Internal Revenue Service. It's something that you can access through your tax return. So who is eligible for the direct pay? Those are tax-exempt entities like nonprofit, churches, but also state and local governments, school districts, rural electric cooperatives, municipalities, and others that are tax exempt in terms of paying federal taxes. Direct pay incentives, and I'm going to be talking about is for solar panels and battery storage and ground source heat pumps, as well as community solar. Those are installed in 2023 through 2033. The solar panels can be installed at the location or address, and that includes rooftop, ground-mounted, carport, etc. It's clean energy devices in that location. And there are additional adders in the tax code. So there's a basic 30% rebate for that clean energy device that is installed in a year, and then it can be obtained or rebate the following year through the tax return. Next slide, please. And so these adders or additional bonuses that are created by the Inflation Reduction Act allows for nonprofits or churches to gain more of benefit by placing those solar panels, those clean energy devices in places that are deemed energy communities. There's a whole map provided by the federal government where you can see those locations. That's a 10% adder. Another 10 percentage point bonus is when you include solar panels that are domestically produced in the United States. And all these bonuses can be stacked up. It's important to know that projects under 1 megawatt are not subject to labor and domestic content requirements. And so you can ask for the tax code to receive the direct payment for projects that are less than 1 megawatt, and that would be really good. I think most churches and nonprofits will install solar panels at less of that size. I mean, that is a lot of panels, and that is a lot of energy that you can use in your facilities. Next slide, please. And so I also want to mention, because there were a lot of questions about energy efficiency tax credit and electrification incentives that can be, and that you can also install in your facilities, and can also be connected to the solar panels that you decide to install. So the energy efficiency tax credit was expanded through IRA, and starting in 2023, it allows nonprofits to benefit from this tax credit when you're renovating a building with energy efficiency improvements like lighting, insulation, HVAC, heat pump installation, and other energy efficiency equipment that result in savings of at least 25%. The nonprofits have to pass that deduction to an intermediary that has enough tax liability, and that will include an architect, a designer, and others, etc. And so it's all retrofits that make the whole building more efficient, that reduce energy and reduce carbon emissions. Next slide, please. And so Here's how you access direct pay. Very important to note is that it's it's it starts when the process starts when you place into service a qualified clean energy project. Not so much when you install the solar panels, but when those solar panels are connected to the grid by your utility. So they are interconnected to the grid and they start generating power for you and for the grid. So there might be a lag between the installation of the projects and paying for the contractors and when they're switched on. And that might also be larger if it's in a new construction building, because it needs to be put, the whole building needs to be open and then needs to be interconnected into the grid. Once you place into service your solar panels, you need to collect the necessary information to pre-register your project with the IRS the following year. So a facility that has placed them in 2023 is already doing the pre-registration. You need to determine your tax year, pre-register with the IRS, and then receive the information. When you do your tax return, you file it, you include all that information in there, and then you can receive your direct payment up to 45 days after filing taxes. So if you do all that process, you file taxes by May of this year or by May of next year. If you have placed into service a solar panel this year, then you will receive it 45 days later. Now, if you opt to extend, if you do an extension, then the clock runs up. So that's why it's important to know that the entire process from installing the solar panels to receiving the direct pay can take anywhere between 4 and 18 months. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, you have the direct pay, you have grants, you have utility rebates that you can stack up. And another thing is the financing. So the financing is an important layer to make sure that your project is economical, and you can install solar panels. There's a lot of federal funds coming very soon from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was also created in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's $27 billion, and that is going to be flowing very soon through the states and through the Solar for All program, green banks, community development finance institutions, credit unions, and other financial institutions through the National Clean Investment Fund and other competitions. That will flow down to programs, to other facilities through low interest loans that can help you install these clean energy devices. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you again for inviting me and happy to answer any questions.
So Miguel, we'll do questions at the end, but yes, please put your questions for Miguel in the chat. And if you have a Miguel specific question, or Eric specific question, any person who you hear speaking, if you have a question specific to them, feel free to note their name when you post their question. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Eric Walker, who has more than 30 years experience in leadership, financial and operations management, and international non-governmental organizations. Eric is the Church Council Chair of Vashon United Methodist Church in Vashon, Washington. Eric, will you share your experience with direct pay with us, please?
Sure. And let me start out by thanking Miguel. I've got several notes over here. I learned even more. So it's a learning process always. So we're a small but mighty United Methodist Church called Vashon United Methodist Church. We have a regular worship about 31 in the budget that's shown on the slide. we're on an island in the middle of the Puget Sound between Seattle and Tacoma. We don't have a bridge and we're only serviced by ferries. We were thinking about going green and talking about what we might do, and all of a sudden the state of Washington put out a proposal for grant applications for solar and storage for communities. So we said, okay, let's go for it. Next slide, please. So we thought about our campus, which has a parsonage in the upper right, an education building in the middle, and a sanctuary on the lower left, and said, okay, how are we going to handle this? Because the grant application required that if we're a house of worship, we be open to the public during power outages. That was a requirement. And so we said, okay, are we willing to do that? Yes, we're willing to do that. And we went to our vendor and said, okay, we need a system that's big enough for us to run everything for 2 to 3 days if there's not much sun. And so they built us a system that would do that. And so we have panels on the parsonage, and the education building roof is perfect for lots of panels, so most of them are there, and the battery wall is hooked on to the sanctuary. We're about halfway through this process. The parsonage work is done. The other part will start soon. Next slide, please. So this is a cutout of the bid that my vendor gave me for a 30 kilowatt, 80 kilowatt per hour solar system with battery. And another catch in that grant I talked about, as you see identified here as the Solar Plus Storage for Resilient Communities program, was that there'd be a 30% match. The state was putting in 70% of the money. We had to come up with 30%. And I had heard about the fact that the law changed so nonprofits could receive a direct payment for an investment tax credit, which before, if you didn't pay taxes, the tax credits were of no use to you. So that's the huge part of the new IRA change. So I said, okay, I'm going to figure this out, and we're going to figure out how to get that $59,000 so we don't have to pay anything for our solar and storage system. Next slide, please. So I'm about halfway through this process, and I boiled it down to 4 basic steps. One, and so some of this you've already heard from Miguel. Some of it, first, is put a qualified system in service. So you find the vendor and you do the bid and you find the money and you get the work done and it's all on the roof and it's all inspected. But now we have to wait a month because the power company doesn't have enough people to go around and check these things out fast enough. So in a few more weeks, part of our system will be put in service. Now, the second big step, so next slide, please. As part of that figuring out your system, it's really important to know which investment credit you qualify for. And this page, which is linked in the slide and I think will be in our resources that we send back out to you, is a really nice page from the IRS that says, here are the clean energy tax incentives that are available to you. This is only the upper part of the page. There's more down below that are more complicated credits. But the one by the arrow is called Investment Tax Credit for Energy Property, pre-2025. And it says for investment in renewable energy projects, including fuel cell, solar, geothermal, small wind, energy storage, biogas, etc. So I said, oh, I see solar and I see energy storage. Okay, that's mine. So I'm going to benefit from section 48. Back on the left-hand column, see in parentheses that squiggly symbol and then 48. You got to remember that number. So let's click for a tip, I think. Figure out your tax credit and remember your tax credit category. You're going to need it later. So throughout this presentation, I've got a few tips for you. So the first thing is find this page, figure out where you fit. The next step is to pre-register with IRS. Now you heard about some of this from Miguel. Next slide, please. What you need to know is that this document is your special guide to pre-register. There's a link here in the slides that you'll receive, and it'll definitely be in the materials we share. Inflation Reduction Act, good old IRA. There's a lot of detail in this, and this is just one page of the user guide and instruction. And there, if you look at the bottom part, there are step-by-step instructions for what you need. Employee identification number. You have to be able to get into the system securely, and you have to decide who the contact person is. I'm not going to go through this now because it is so well spelled out in this book. So next, one more click, please, Jonathan. So tip number 2, read this user guide very carefully and follow the instructions verbatim. Don't do what I sometimes do on these things and go, oh, there's too much detail. I can figure it out. I'm just going to poke and click and fill in fields, and I'm sure it'll work. Bad idea on this one. Take the time, print it out, get yourself a pen, and mark it off as you go through it. A second tip here is to find out if your church has ever filed with the IRS. It may have required a Form 990, which is an informational return that nonprofits file with the IRS. But many churches and forms of houses of worship are exempt from filing the Form 990. So you may never have filed a return with the IRS. That is okay, because this guide tells you that we're going to let you use this one tax form to file. You don't have to do the full 990, but we have to know what your tax accounting year is. So if you've never filed, you may never have declared a tax year with the IRS, which is a good thing, because if you finish and put in practice your project in February and you declare your accounting tax year to be calendar year, you can't file your request for the direct pay payment until after December, following the September you put your system in service. So you could declare an earlier tax accounting year, like maybe June, and then you could file after June and not have to wait as long for the payment. So it's important to know whether you've already declared a tax year with the IRS. It's a little bit complicated, but it's an important tip. Next slide, please. Third step, file 990T, Form 990T for tax with special investment tax credit forms. Next slide, please. So in this perfect book that gets you all the way through the pre-registration process, it tells you exactly what part of the Form 990T will be used to report the elective payment amount, which is the first step in getting your money. So I just want to mention briefly that I went ahead and started the pre-registration process, even though my system isn't in practice yet, because you can go through pretty far into the process and it will let you save your work. And so you can get as far as you can and get all of that kind of headachy work done about access to the system and plugging in all the information, and then save it. Then you can wait for your system to be fully put into practice and start it up again, which is my plan. So next slide, please. So this is just roughly what the 990T looks like. It's classic IRS kind of tax form. You fill in, just follow the instructions, and there's a publication that goes along with it. But, next slide, next click. You need Form 3800 to be behind the 990T to fill in numbers from the 3800. But wait, there's more. Click, please. You also have to have the Form 3468 that feeds into the 3800, that feeds into the 990T. The 3468 is where the action is. That's where you need to know your tax category and where you actually plug in, here's the cost of my system, here's the 30%, here's the amount I want back, and that flows up to the 3800 and over to the 990T. Click. Don't freak out. Hire or find a qualified tax accountant or advisor. There's an emerging group of people, I think, that understand all of this stuff. And you can either try it yourself by reading all the guides or just go find somebody who knows how to do it. Next slide, please. So the last step is receive the payment. As Miguel mentioned, the forms are due no later than 5 months after the end of your stated accounting year. Payments will be made within 45 days once the forms are filed, according to the IRS. Next slide, please. Or tip. Realize the payment will not come until the end of the process, so make sure you have the cash flow to handle it or secure financing. We, for example, have a bridge loan from our local church-based private foundation that was created to make loans for churches to renovate their buildings. So we have a bridge loan from them that's allowing us to pay for the bills up front because our grant is cost reimbursement. So we have to wait for that money to come. And then at the very end, we have to wait for the direct pay to show up as well. Next slide, please. If you're brand new to this, start here at the White House webpage. I call it the Expandomatic White House webpage because it has 6 very clearly defined steps to apply for direct pay. Next slide, please. And it's Expandomatic because when you click on one of those pluses in the blue dot, it gives you a very cool paragraph explaining a little bit more about what they mean and some excellent hot links to the next level of detail that you need. So while our slide deck here is certainly wonderful, I think this White House tool is really very good for bringing not only you into the game, but also your church councils or trustees. I think this is a good place to go. Next slide, please. Last tip, 30% funding or even more, as Miguel explained, for a project is significant, but make sure you and your faith community has the stomach for the process, has somebody that's a little bit obsessive compulsive about detail, loves a process, loves administrative detail. This isn't so much as a heart and soul thing, it's a brain administrative process, and you've got to have somebody like that thinks this is cool stuff. I obviously am that person for my church because I did this for 30 years as my job. I think that's it. Is there one more slide? Are we done? There we go. Looking forward to the questions at the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric. Friends, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that both our panelists and also everyone here on this webinar, we're all pioneers in this work. This is a brand new program that has not been seen before. The government is figuring out how to do it. We're figuring out how to do it. Eric talked about how it is a challenging process and not for the faint of heart. I wonder how we might each call on our religious traditions to think about stories that we know about what it takes to walk down a new road or create a new road, and how we might be leaders in our religious traditions. Even though as we have all these questions, there's so many great questions here. How can we experience the frustration that brings, but also embrace it and think about how we can take what we're learning on this journey and be ready to share it with others so we can spread this fantastic opportunity. All right, let's jump in here with questions. Miguel, I want to go back to something that you raised about energy communities. Can you please, Miguel, define what is an energy community? And you're on mute. Could you please unmute?
Yes, so an energy community is one that, as explained below, is is a place that has had high levels of employment related to the fossil fuel industry since December 31st, 2009, had a mine closed after December 31st, 1999, and had an employment rate at or above the national employment rate for the prior year, or had a coal-fired electrical generated unit retired after December 31st, 2009. All these are very detailed points in the Inflation Reduction Act, which then the federal government has boiled it down into a map that you can find. I believe it's on in the direct pay fact sheet that's been put in the chat. If not, you can you can try to find it if you Google Department of Energy, energy communities or energy communities um, tax credit adder. Regardless, uh, there are communities around the country that fit the description, mostly in the Appalachian area, in the West, Rocky Mountains, that can benefit from if a clean energy device is placed in those locations, can ask for an additional 10 percentage points. And so they can add that to the base credit of 30%.
So perhaps one very simple way to think about energy communities is communities that have been disproportionately impacted by negative impacts of fossil fuels. And then on again, back to you, Miguel, low income community bonus. One of our participants says, I read that the low income community bonus is not automatic, even if your community qualifies, that there are limited funds for that. And so they have to be applied for. Is that correct, that low income community bonus, that extra 10% has to be applied for outside of this?
Yes, the low income community bonus also detailed in the fact sheet. It starts with a separate program through the Department of Energy. And so you have to apply to that program and you have to be selected. There is, according to the law, there is about 5 gigawatts of opportunity under this program. There's also up to 20% um, uh, additional percentage points that can be added if it's placed in a tribal community. There's a lot of opportunities, but at the end of the day, you have to go through a Department of Energy program, and then once you get selected, then you have to go into the tax code through your tax return.
Great. Thank you. Hey, I just realized I was so excited about all your amazing questions that I forgot to share a couple slides with you that will help answer your questions. Jonathan, could you pull up my first slide, please? Basically, I wanted to take a step back because we have just thrown a really incredible amount of information at you. And I know that a huge percentage of you are just beginning to start to think about it. And so I wanted to pull back to where you might be if you're just at the start of this journey in terms of thinking about, like, where do I even begin? And there's all this information about money and tax stuff, but like, I barely even started thinking about solar. I'm really only thinking about it because I saw this webinar and wanted to learn more. And I want to emphasize again, this particular webinar is focused on solar. There are other direct pay opportunities available. Miguel mentioned a few, and there are more available in the resources online. We're focusing here on solar just to keep it narrow because it's an hour webinar. So just backing up to the very beginning, before you do anything around this payment opportunity, you need to ask yourself and figure out in your community if solar is right for you. You need to, if you are not part of the community of key decision makers in your house, in your community, you need to get into conversation with them to talk about how the facilities are managed and how decisions are made when it comes to changing facilities. That group will need to look at the building condition and its readiness, its location and exposure to the sun. These are things that you can get information about by talking with solar vendors. Getting the support of those key decision makers, and then financing. And I want to go to the next slide to take a minute to talk about the money piece and really lift up how to think about this. So I've seen a lot of questions in the chat where people are saying, well, what if you're not a nonprofit, or do you have to be a nonprofit to access these resources? So I want to explain that a little bit. prior to the IRA, there was already a federal program in place that provided a 30% tax credit to solar vendors or solar, solar vendors included, but to for-profit entities with solar. So they would get a 30% tax credit. They file their taxes, they get that 30% tax credit when they install solar. Vendors can claim that tax credit and use it in two different ways. So if you are in a position where you don't wish, or your house of worship does not wish to purchase and own a solar energy system, there are a couple options. One is to lease the system. That's essentially renting a system for a fixed period of time. When the lease ends, most vendors will give the option to either purchase the system or they'll take it back. And the lessee will pay a fixed monthly rate for the use of that system. Another option is called a power purchase agreement. This is different from a lease in that the vendor puts the array on the building, and then the building owner purchases electricity at a fixed rate determined, through a contract, purchases electricity from the vendor who owns the solar array on the building. So in both cases, typically the building owner doesn't put up any money up front beyond ensuring the roof is solar ready. The vendor does all the installation, does all the operations and maintenance, and bills the building owner either for that monthly lease fee or for the energy use. In that situation, typically the vendor will claim the tax credit and they will build that 30% into the pricing that they are offering the client. So that's one way that a tax opportunity, that this money from the federal government can be captured without any of this direct pay business. So I just want you to know that's an option that's existed for a while, and it is still an option. The new thing here with direct pay is that now nonprofits, not just for-profits, but nonprofits can get a 30% direct payment from the federal government. It's not a tax benefit because nonprofits don't pay taxes. So the two ways that, two very simple ways, it can get more complicated, that a nonprofit can finance their system is either with cash, pay cash up front for the system, file your file the forms needed to claim the direct payment, and then get your payment back. Another is a combination of short and long-term loans. The thing to remember is that you typically have to pay for your system upfront with a vendor, but you've already heard that there's a gap in time between when your system is ready to go and when you get the money back from your tax credit. So you need your direct payment. So you will need a short-term loan for that window of time that could be anywhere from 4 months to 18 months or 24 months. And you need to have some way to bridge that gap. Then you may need additional loan funds for the rest of the system that isn't covered through that direct payment. The thing to know when you're talking with solar vendors is they can give you a time frame for return on investment. They will be able to tell you, based on how big an array they're recommending, how much energy they expect you to purchase and use, etc., how much time it will take for you to pay back for the system so that then the energy beyond that is free. If you are going to own your own system, you also need to be familiar with the warranties on the major components, including inverters and panels, because those parts, you should be prepared for them to die at the end of their warranty periods and be prepared to replace them. So there is some additional cost over time. Those are the points I wanted to share with you about things to be thinking about as you're starting to plan this. Let me go back now to our Q&A here. There are a couple questions here related to time sensitivity. So I'm going to put both of these questions out there and invite either of you to respond. One is, are the total value of these federal funds limited, So if we drag our feet, we might miss out on being able to access this funding. And then the second one is Trump says that he is going to cancel the IRA. If there's a change in administration, is there a risk that this program won't continue? Do either of you have responses to these questions?
I can start, I guess. I would say that to the first one, I think the horizon on the tax credits is pretty long, and notwithstanding number two, I think those are pretty steady. Where the time limitations come in are some of the other federal funding programs where there will be grant application windows, and especially when the money's going to flow down to the lowest level, which Miguel alluded to. These big programs that have launched are still up in the higher levels and they haven't started to flow down. Those will have specific, I think, application windows. So tax credit, I would say, is going to last, but the other ones, maybe not, other kinds of grants funds. And I don't predict anything about Mr. Trump.
Yeah,
I
perhaps a
would
better way to put it is simply a change in administration. And yeah, go ahead, Miguel. Thanks.
I would agree with Eric on the grants and other programs. Direct pay is available as stated in the law through 2033. The IRA was a law passed by Congress, so Congress will have the authority to restrict it or to take it out in its entirety. I think working here in DC, the important element is always the demand of this program and your voices. I think it's very important if you are placing and putting into service solar panels and battery storage this year in 2024, and you can then tell your stories through IPL or other organizations or UMC or others, and those stories of you putting on those clean energy devices can and will reach lawmakers, and they can think about how how they will make their vote once that comes into them, that decision to repeal the law. So that I think that's very important. I think that goes into democracy, the fact that you are creating demand for the program by placing these energy devices in your facilities, and you are actively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I think it's something to feel proud about.
Thanks, Miguel. I think this might be a good one for you, Eric. If a house of worship normally files an annual IRS Form 990, would they also need to file a 990T? Or is the 990T only an alternate if you don't do a 990?
No, the 990T is a form that nonprofits use if they have taxes to pay. And taxes come from earning unrelated business income. That's why the form was originally designed, that if you provided a service, like hospital gift shops kind of got into this area, if you provided a service where you made money, then, and it wasn't consistent with your exempt purpose, it was called unrelated business income, and you had to pay, I think it was 15% tax on that income. So the 990T, the interesting thing about direct pay is they're using the 990T as a standalone reporting form. Normally, you do a 990 and accompany a 990T with it if you have unrelated business income. But in this case, they're just using the 990T standalone. So if you filed a 990 before, then you've got to deal with that tax year. And then you would also do a 990T on that same tax year.
And then I'm not sure if this is, forgive me if you cover this. There are several people who also heard you mention an alternative to the 990T. Is that right?
No.
Or is that a confusion? Okay.
If I said that, I misspoke.
Okay.
You're stuck with the 990T if you want to get the direct payment
Okay,
method.
okay. Eric, stick with us here. Let's talk about pre-registration. Can you pre-register with the IRS before you start your project? And if you might be a year or more away from starting your project?
In my experience, you can get started anytime that you want. You just that you can't complete the registration process until you know your put in service date.
Okay, you can get started on registering anytime you want.
Yeah, which I think is a good thing because there's some kind of stuff to study and figure out what they mean. There's a thing called ID.me that's the new security access methodology for IRS, and so you have to make sure you have one of those accounts set up.
Okay, and when you say put into service, what does that mean?
That means, as Miguel mentioned in his presentation, up and running, and your net metering agreement where you are exchanging power with the power grid is all in place. You're fully inspected and you're showing a complete power discount on your bill. So it
Okay,
isn't just put in place, it's put in service.
got it. Okay, now what if a nonprofit needs a new roof or needs to install a carport? Can they include that in their, will this program pay for a new roof or a new carport or a structure on which to put the solar array?
In my experience and research, the answer is no.
Okay.
That is not part of the energy system. Miguel, do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that. Roof replacement is not, it's not part of the investment tax credit.
Okay.
And in the state grant program I was involved in, they explicitly said, no, we don't do roofs either. So one roof had to be replaced and we had to pay for that ourselves.
Okay. And then what if, if a nonprofit is thinking big and they have multiple buildings, can they do it piece by piece and 1 year complete, the solar on one building and then another year complete solar on another building and, request the direct payments as they grow their projects?
Yeah, I would say the answer to that is yes. You just have to work closely with your vendor to make sure that your installations are modularized so
Mhm.
you could kind of wrap it up, make it complete, put it in service. Like in our
Mhm.
project, the parsonage is a standalone system. So we can get that in service much sooner and begin the process for that because it's standalone and we can meet the definition of put in service. It looks like Miguel's nodding away, so I think he agrees with that.
And so a parsonage is a residence that is owned by the church or nonprofit, but because it is part of the nonprofit's physical plant, it is eligible, unlike
Yes,
normal residential properties.
right. And it's because it's part of our campus and we own it and our preacher lives there as part of our total function, it's considered commercial and therefore eligible for nonprofit tax credit. If it
Okay,
was separate as a residence, then of course you could get the tax credit from a residential way and individuals pay tax. So it's pretty easy, always has been.
great, good. Well, friends, we have learned quite a bit today and also discovered how much more we may still need to learn to be able to move forward this. I want to thank our presenters and also thank all of you for spending an hour with us to dip your toe into these wonderful waters. And again, thank you for your leadership. And your leadership is desperately needed at this moment. It really takes people like us to step out into this challenge, into this opportunity. It can work, it will work. And we're needed to be pioneers to make this happen, to show demand, and to show others we can do this. We can transform our houses of worship in ways that reflect the values that we hold as communities of faith, and to bear witness to others in our community about the world we want to be a part of creating, a world that's sustainable and just and ensures the flourishing of all. Thank you for your time today and look forward to an email in the next couple of days with the resources and recording links that we mentioned. Have a good day. Bye-bye.